That's working. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Vikram. I'm a researcher at University of Central Florida. Also work with Dr. David Metcalf, who's sitting next to me. My background and mostly the work I've done is in trying to figure out implementations of blockchain in existing infrastructure. So how can blockchain supplement currently existing technologies? So I want a panel to introduce themselves.
Okay. Well, I'm David Metcalf, and I work at the University of Central Florida running a research and technology lab that spins off different companies. Vikram's being a little bit modest. Last year, he won a National Science Foundation award to spin off a company on blockchain called HealthShares, and also got the attention of Google and got himself into med school with a scholarship as well, too, for a DO. So that's why he's here. He wrote an article for Bitcoin, too. So I do your intro for you. Okay. Yeah, but I've been involved with these guys and some of the other people in the lab around blockchain and looking at the interoperability within electronic health records and beyond the electronic health record, too, into the payment arbitrage and other areas like that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gurdain Bhatani. I'm a partner and founder at FundRx. We're a venture capital firm based in New York, investing across the spectrum in healthcare. So everything from life sciences companies through health IT and blockchain-oriented businesses as a result. We take a science-first approach to investing. So we work with almost 2,000 experts across physicians, scientists, et cetera, to due diligence companies that we work with. And it's been an exciting first year for us, and excited to invest in some blockchain companies in the coming months and years.
My name is Matthew Spoke. I'm from Toronto, founder and CEO of a blockchain infrastructure company called Nuco. We're pretty low-level infrastructure focusing on kind of the creation of enterprise blockchain networks and the intelligence layer, the logic layer that sits above those networks. Obviously a big interest in the healthcare space and what that functionality and that technology could unlock. I'll be demoing kind of a prototype we've been working on with Deloitte later this afternoon. But just here to bring a blockchain perspective to the conversation.
So I'm Jody Daniel, and I think I'm the odd man out here, or woman out, as the case may be. I am a partner at the law firm of Kroll & Moring. I started a new digital health practice there where I'm advising companies on the intersection of law policy and business strategy. Before that, though, I spent 15 years in government at the Department of Health and Human Services, 10 of which was setting policy for health IT at the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology. So the reason we actually have electronic health records in most hospitals and doctors' offices is because of the incentives that we put forward from the department. And so I come at it from sort of a policy and a legal perspective and understanding and watching the health IT market for the last 10 years. Oh, and I have to apologize. I'm going to be leaving about 10 minutes early to go to the CLE. There's an overlap, so when you see me walk out, it's not because the conversation isn't interesting, but because I have to be in two places at once.
Jody might leave during the Q&A, so we'll say, if you have questions, Jody can answer. I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. So introductions are out of the way, so let's get started with some material and content. First, probably just to the panel, I want to get the idea. So blockchain is an enabling technology. I don't have too much time to get into what that exactly, encompasses, but it essentially just means it allows other technologies to become more available. One of the holy grails that blockchain's promised is interoperability, especially with electronic health records. So I just want to get the panel's perspective on where they think we sort of stand at the moment with electronic health records and blockchain.
I'll start since I've been doing this for some time, and what I've been noticing is that as we've been pushing out electronic health records and pushing for interoperability, there has been a real failure in achieving that vision, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Some of them are just the business factors. People don't actually want to share the information, and folks want to own that information, they want to control it, and so there's sort of a disincentive to make it easy to share that information. And this is something that folks have been working on for a long time. The reason I'm really interested in blockchain as a potential supporter for interoperability is because I think it could be disruptive and change some of those business dynamics and really spark some innovation, engage the patient who has a lot to gain by that information being shared, and where it could also provide more control for that patient in having that information shared where and when they want it to be shared.
I totally agree with Jody and everything you just said. I think I would add that today the way that when you look at EHRs, today essentially hospitals, providers, et cetera, own the data. In theory, we want patients to own their own health data, but that's not what happens in practice, at least in the United States. And I think what really excites me about blockchain is that the decentralization of records creates an opportunity to sort of give patients permissions to their own data across a whole set of providers. And so I think that's sort of one of the key promises that blockchain affords in sort of this debate.
I think one of the challenges that's going to come up kind of repeatedly, I think already this morning a lot, is that blockchains, have a lot of potential. They have a lot of promise in this space, but we're dealing with the reality of existing infrastructure that is already there, that's already kind of caked into the system. Kind of like digging a new subway tunnel in Manhattan is not all that easy. So what I find particularly interesting is this becoming kind of a leapfrog technology in markets that are potentially less developed in terms of their existing EHR, EMR infrastructures. Interoperability definitely, but kind of how do you go about it into an existing system that already has all of its complexities and regulations around it, or do you go about it as a new way to create a new system from scratch? I think it'll be really neat to watch the United States learn from less developed markets, less developed economies.
Yeah, we've seen some of that when we've gone places like Haiti and parts of East Africa too, where they have highly developed mobile payment systems that can auto-arbitrage, and the way that can be cross-utilized. If we could bring a touch of that back to our much more regulated industry here, that'd be very interesting. The interoperability factor is not only between the electronic health record systems themselves, but what is upstream and downstream of that? By that I mean, what happens when you have a wearable that you want to get the tracked data into that record? Can you use blockchain techniques or peer-to-peer to be able to do that? And if you want to speed up the arbitrage of medical bill payment, coding, things like that, how is that influenced by what happens at the electronic health record level?
I want to actually bring it back to something that Matt mentioned. What are some of the biggest lessons you think that U.S. could learn from, especially in electronic health records, from countries that are not, as developed, just in terms of just leapfrog? So where does that come in your perspective internationally, not just limited to the U.S., where interoperability may be a problem? Are there lessons we can learn?
And I think maybe the U.S. we use as a proxy for like Western economies in general. I mean, EMR is not a new topic. I think EMRs were first introduced maybe in the 1960s as a better way of tracking and keeping records on patients. What EMRs have not gone through their full potential on is how do you make sure that you don't end up with just a whole bunch of different siloed systems that are written in different languages that are not compatible with each other, different standards that emerge based on when these technologies evolved. What I think is going to be really interesting is looking at markets where potentially EMRs have not really taken hold yet, where you're still very much dealing with paper records, old filing cabinets and handwritten notes, and then being able to kind of take that as a starting point and say, well, how do we create the digital health system for that market? You probably won't go through the same evolution that a Western country would have done. You'll probably just jump to the most available and ready technology at the time that you're doing that. And today, that'll likely include some sort of distributed system like a blockchain. Whereas when Western economies like the US and others were going through this hadn't really emerged yet. So they didn't have the opportunity to kind of implement it at the onset of this movement towards electronic records. Not too long ago, I think in the last 6 months or so, the government of Estonia announced a project with GuardTime. GuardTime, I think, was intended to be here today with us, to do 1 million patient records on connected to a blockchain network. That's kind of an unfeasible and conceptually really difficult thing to wrap your head around in a U.S. context. How do you get to the ability to do 1 million records? And there's probably not many things that the U.S. government would openly say we want to learn from Estonia, but that would be one that I think is probably a good learning opportunity.
Yeah, Estonia has been particularly good with that. I remember, I think even Skype, the founders are from Estonia. Yeah. Just are irrelevant tidbits. So,
also the first country to do all electronic voting.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. I want to bring back to something you mentioned, Dr. Metcalf, which was the role of wearables, and obviously open to the whole panel. What role do you think wearables play as an add-on to electronic health records, and particularly, how can blockchain be an interface between the two? Can it be an interface even? just some of the design considerations. Is the blockchain ever even meant for getting that constant stream of data?
Yeah, so what my context is we've been looking at ways that we could do two things. One is look at identity with something that's a wearable. There's a tool that we have in our lab called a NIMI band, N-Y-M-I, NIMI band, and it does Bluetooth combined for security combined with multi-factor heart rate variability. So more accurate than your fingerprint, but using your stroke, flow, and pulse as 3 variants. And then if you tie that in with a blockchain record, then you have something that gives you, again, multiple variables in there to be able to use against that. The other is how do you get the double-edged sword of how do you get the data from a patient that you want to have continuous monitoring of? And I think that's a very interesting thing that many people are interested in. There's been a lot of debunking of that lately with some of the Fitbit areas and other things that have happened that have been kind of negatives on that, and also with providers being a little skeptical of that too. But ultimately, we want to try and get some of that data in there where it's useful and actionable for the patient or the provider.
One, the concept of wearables, obviously that's an emerging field that needs its own time and opportunity to mature
definitely.
and evolve. But when we think of health records today, I think we're more often thinking of like sickness records. Because what hits my health record is moments in time where I end up in a clinic or I end up in a hospital or I end up under some sort of medical care. A health record really is exactly what David's talking about, is the opportunity for me to demonstrate healthy lifestyle, healthy behavior throughout the span of my life, and use that as kind of a new mechanism of measuring my health as an individual, rather than, my health record today probably shows my vaccinations, my broken bones, and, my interactions with doctors, when health records really should be more encompassing of the moments in my life when I was healthy, because that starts to become really meaningful from an insurance perspective and from the incentive of flipping this from a care model to the word's escaping me, from trying to get people out of hospitals and out of clinics rather than living healthy lives. And I think that's kind of the interesting opportunity with wearables, where they kind of can monitor you throughout your life when you're not in a hospital, when you're not in a clinic.
I think what's interesting is you have to think about what is the right use case and figuring out how you can, at least in the early stages, what's a narrow use case that you can show success. I think there are a couple of problems with wearables where maybe blockchain can be helpful. One is lots of providers are concerned about the patient identity and making sure that they know where that information is coming from and that it is accurate and there's data integrity with respect to that information. They're also concerned about the volume of data, but they're not necessarily going to be as concerned with all this volume of healthy behaviors. And so then the question is there may be different use cases and different models to be thinking about, some for purposes of consumption by a healthcare provider and some for purposes of consumption by the individual themselves, by a caregiver and things like that. And it's really important to think about what's the right use case and then setting it up so that you can figure out how to consume the right data for the right purpose.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, a lot of physicians that I talk to are generally wary of tons and tons of data being collected at point of care. It's just hard to digest and process all that information in a particular acute clinical context, whereas longitudinal data collected over time might be valuable to insurers, as you said. So I think that's exactly right. Yeah,
and probably worth mentioning, because blockchains often get discussed as kind of this pixie dust that's going to solve all of our problems.
Right.
There's things that they are good at and things that they are not good at, and one thing that they are absolutely not good at is an enormous amount of data coming in on a very, very frequent basis. The limitations and the performance abilities of blockchain architectures are not designed for that. The inherent redundancy of creating kind of a distributed system is that it's probably not well set up for this constant inflow of data. So finding the right balance between how do you take advantage of the type of data you might collect off of a wearable device, and then how does that interact with? I mean, we did some work around the concept of incentivization of healthy behavior using a blockchain as like a token issuance system because you proved healthy behavior through the use of a wearable device. That's not necessarily as it pertains to your record, but it is using a blockchain kind of ancillary to the data you're getting off a wearable.
I think one sort of crucial point of confusion is part of the language that we use, which is data stored on the blockchain. Now, what does that mean? I'm somewhat familiar with the way GEM does this, and I think that's sort of going to be the right way. you can't essentially store data on the blockchain because everybody has to have a copy. You imagine if I start storing my x-rays on it after a year of them, I mean, given that I get a bunch of injuries, after a year of it, it'd be too big to store, it would be too bloated. What you really can do is pointers. You can store pointers and validate them. Essentially, if those of you who are in the crowd are engineers, you create essentially a file system on the blockchain. So in Linux, we have in nodes, we have all these capabilities in file systems. Those you can replicate very, very well and enable on the blockchain. So back to the panel, particularly Jody. Electronic health records now, with them coming out and becoming sort of a mainstream thing, what does that mean in terms of ownership and assets? Do they become patient assets? Who owns them? What does that mean in the case of, especially in blockchain where you have distributed assets? Where does that, it sort of blurs out, so could you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way things are right now, legally, the records of the healthcare provider in the hospital are their business records. They own them. And the way that the legal construct is set up is that patients have a right and have some ability to control that information. And that the doctors and hospitals have some responsibility with respect to the information that they hold, more as data stewards. But that the patient doesn't own that data. What the patient does have is a right to get a copy of that data. So they have a right to access any information that the provider has about them, not just even what's in their medical record, but even broader. It's anything that the doctor has about them that might be used to make a decision about them, or that the health plan has about them. I don't think blockchain won't change the ownership, meaning that the doctor still will own a copy of that record, but if the patient can access that record and be able to have their own copy where they do have ownership and control and where they can pull that information from a variety of sources and make decisions about how it's used, then blockchain can help facilitate the patient's ability to control the flow of data that they hold for themselves and for the purposes that they want that data to be used.
Yeah, that stewardship is actually a thorny issue, quite difficult. We won one of those Regional Extension Center awards at University of Central Florida for our region from the Office of National Coordinator during that era. And we had high ambitions to have a regional health information organization that could share between all the hospitals, allow patients access, allow you to have a continuous stream interoperability. And we got there, technically. But then we started to have this issue of who's in charge of the stewardship, how much does that stewardship cost over time, and who's going to pay for that? And it became quite a thorny issue when there's no specific direct reimbursement for those things. It got to be a lot of weight for either a regional community to carry on, or worse yet, for the individual patient to have stewardship over that and have to keep track of it on behalf of themselves and the hospital systems. So that was one of the things that we saw, and that's perhaps a place where this was a different era, but where blockchain could come in and help with some of those things so that you could just take the right, high context, right information at the right time for the right purpose, but not have to have full custodianship over it for your lifetime.
And you can have a situation where the patient can help manage the flow of that information, so it can take some of the responsibility off of the healthcare provider if the patient authorizes using or disclosure of that information, right?
Yeah, to Matt and Gerdane, I just wanted to get you guys' perspective. Let's say in some near future we sort of have the level of access, the patient has a level of access that Dr. Metcalf and Jody talked about. How do you two see that being incorporated into insurance? So will that be just like you pay for Netflix, you pay for file hosting? Would that become specific to, data hosting that's scans, prescription medication? Will that be separated? How do you envision that happening down the line?
I think, one of the things that you have to identify when you're dealing with kind of healthcare data is where do the incentives lie. And insurance, I think, is a really interesting side of the equation where there's an enormous desire by insurers to have a better, wholesome view of the actual risk profile associated to the people that they're insuring. And if this could provide that, then I could see that there would be an incentive on an insurer to provide this as kind of a utility to the people that they insure, as a mechanism for them to say, well, now we have a much more accurate view of who you are and what you do. And the trade-off can be exactly what Jody and David were talking about, this custodianship or this right to access, that if I'm getting this ability to create and maintain my own medical record, then maybe what I'm giving up in exchange is visibility into that data to my insurance company, for example. What I find particularly interesting is when people start relying and this maybe starts to get a little bit science fiction-y and into the future, but when people start relying on mechanisms to identify patterns in their health or mechanisms to diagnose issues with their health that fall outside of the traditional kind of healthcare industry. We work very closely with Ethereum as a technology. And what Ethereum has kind of unlocked is this opportunity to create these distributed autonomous entities or these distributed autonomous organizations. The most famous one of which made the news a few months ago for poorly managing people's money. But you could take that concept of like self-sovereign software, give it characteristics like the ability to analyze data and potentially come up with diagnostics that today is very difficult for a tech company to go into the diagnostics world is very challenging because you're not certified or you're not FDA approved. But if it's a piece of software sitting somewhere in this kind of ether that nobody really controls and nobody really holds, but me as a patient, I have the ability to upload my information into it and decide if I want to act on the feedback it's giving me. That goes completely outside of the bounds of like a regulated healthcare organization.
Actually, it's in the U.S. It would be if you're making health recommendations to a patient, it would certainly be regulated in a pretty robust way. But I think you're right, though, in the idea that outside of insurance, there are a lot of applications of a centralized data store. From a drug discovery standpoint, for instance, we see a lot of companies that there's a company called Globovir that's doing incredible bioinformatics work on incredible patient data that they've been able to acquire from a number of hospital systems, and that can be used for developing therapeutics, for developing personalized medications, for diagnosing conditions. That all being said, I think if you look at sort of the issues that even a company like 23andMe has gone through,
I was just about to mention
around
that.
regulation.
Medicine.
Yeah, there's a lot of regulatory hurdles to overcome.
Yeah, 23andMe was a very interesting example. They would basically, take your genome and was it like $99, I think, or they would take a swab and they would send back results along with, they would give like percentages. So you have a 9% chance of developing diabetes, which is basically ignorable, but maybe not in some cases. And that created a lot of anxiety for people. And the FDA stepped in. They're like, you can't do this. So now if you order a profile from 23andMe, they withhold all the disease markers and they just give you your genome. So that was an interesting way to see how they would.
They're starting to come back around, though. They're going to loosen this.
There's a set of approved genetic tests now that have clinical documentation that they're allowed to show. But
Yeah, FDA had basically said that they didn't demonstrate that their information was accurate to make those kind of health claims. And so right now they're doing it, claim by claim.
Right.
And they have a set that are acceptable. But it does raise the point of, if in fact you're making health claims based on data, that it may trigger regulatory involvement like the FDA.
I imagine regulatory agencies will have to adapt if the blockchain and if people become interested in it, they'd have to adapt. Recently, Congress just they have a special caucus now for blockchain development and organizations. So they are going to start taking a look at it in a very new, interesting ways, things that weren't previously available. So you can imagine blockchain being one of the points in presidential debates. No, I'm kidding. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen.
There's no substantive policy this time around.
No.
There actually was a bill recently introduced into the House of Representatives that explicitly mentions the use of blockchain. I'm blanking on what it was for.
The veterans.
I think it was for healthcare,
I think it was the Veterans Affairs Office, actually.
It was for VA, that's right.
Yeah, so I'm actually working with Joseph, I don't know if he's here, from GEM. We're putting together an article to just sort of highlight how the VA can benefit from a very simple application of blockchain, which is identity management. When it comes out, we'll talk more about it. I don't want to disclose too much. In any case, one of the points brought up earlier, which is very interesting, was how the components of the blockchain have been present in Bitcoin in general. Hashcash, which is one of the core technologies, had been around since 1990s. It was proposed to be a way to minimize spam. Satoshi took 4 or 5 of these, combined them together to solve the Byzantine generals problem. I don't want to get too much into that, but I do want to ask you, Dr. Metcalf, to talk briefly about something I'm familiar with, which is Medishare, which have been doing a lot of the same stuff that blockchain does without actually being blockchain.
Yeah, sure. So A number of years ago, instead of insurance, a number of people opted out into health sharing ministries, and recently with the Accountable Care Act, there's been an exemption for health sharing ministries. For those who haven't heard of that, it's basically taking what you would have had for insurance coverage and kind of following a different model of being able to pay those. So it's peer-to-peer based arbitrage that goes directly from one account to another of each member. And if you start to hear what that sounds like, you start to think about some of the things that you would do with a blockchain-based model. So we've been using those models along with some pretty intense encryption for a number of years, the SHA-256, and really allowing you to do a couple of things, solve a couple of problems. If we were to put the money together, it would be pooled, and then your insurance. It's not insurance. You have to keep it separate. So there was legitimate business reasons for doing that. The other was that instead of just transactional, we wanted to be transformational. So I'm on the board of this organization, and if you think about sending an encouraging word or a kind thought or a prayer or something like that to someone, you want to try and do that, but you also need to keep someone's health information private too. So you really do have to carve off the information that can be shared as a continuous stream while you still have some others. So you see some of the building blocks around what you would have for use of blockchain. And we're kind of heading in that direction anyway, because we've already got the fundamental building blocks along with a patent on some of that arbitrage of sharing account to account in ACH. So those are some of the things that maybe are a little different model. I heard Charlie say earlier that the royalty won't lead the revolution. This is kind of something that is a group outside of the mainstream that's doing this, but it's grown in popularity. It's grown pretty wildly, about 350 million this year in terms of arbitrage of billing, and 200,000 members. So it's growing pretty rapidly too, that people are interested in this different model of doing this.
Okay, let's jump topics slightly and talk about security. Often been one of the most easily understood and selling points of trying to transition over to the blockchain is security. Hospitals, I think somebody earlier mentioned like 90% or something have been hit by security problems. We were just talking about the ransomware that hit a couple of hospitals where all their access to their own electronic health records got frozen. They had to pay like, I think 120 Bitcoins or something like that. I forget exactly. So just to the panel, how does the panel think that blockchain will be able to help alleviate some of the security risks, and particularly just focused on single points of failure? So one of the big things in blockchain is that it can eliminate a lot of single points of failure being a distributed system. And add on to that, where does it introduce new single points of failure? I want to be just very clear. Blockchain is not end-all, be-all. It never will be. People think it is, but like really it's not. So if it solves problems here, it'll introduce a whole bunch somewhere else.
So I think because there's no data actually being stored on a blockchain, the chain would be useful from an audit perspective. So you might have data at a handful of providers, and essentially what you could use a chain for would be to verify whether or not someone attempting to access that record is the legitimate actor, is engaged in appropriate use of those data, and make a sort of judgment call on whether or not that's appropriate, leveraging the sort of auditing immutability capabilities of a blockchain. But other than that, I mean, if you still think about data being stored at a particular, on a particular provider's server, you're still open to any sort of threat that can attack that system, even if you are leveraging a blockchain.
I think one of the, sometimes gets confused in the discussion of blockchain is like, where's the storage of data happening versus where's the record of transaction happening? Because, as was just mentioned, the storage of data, although in some cases could be stored into a smart contract, could be stored onto a blockchain, most architectures of solutions would probably say that that's not efficient. You're putting at risk some sort of level of privacy about the information. But there's this whole kind of side topic of emerging technology happening around distributed storage. Technologies like IPFS that are designed to interoperate quite seamlessly with blockchains to say, well, if I could break up this data file and distribute it across a network of storage capacity, such that there's no single point of failure for someone to view that information. Because one thing that doesn't often come up in the context of a blockchain, it is more secure to a certain extent. I mean, if I have a Bitcoin sitting on the Bitcoin network, it's very difficult for somebody to change the ownership of that Bitcoin. but we've also introduced the ability for multiple points of visibility into the network. So you potentially remove the privacy around the content of that transaction. So even if I'm talking about an enterprise blockchain network like what we build, let's say we're creating a network for a network of healthcare providers in the United States or something like that, you remove the ability for somebody to change information, but you give 10 or 100 or 1,000 points of access to read that information. Because at any single one of those nodes sitting on that blockchain, there's visibility into the network. So there's a trade-off when you talk about privacy and security. And then there's this whole kind of parallel concept of where do you actually store the data? Because if you're just putting it back into centralized storage, there's the same old limitations and vulnerabilities still exist. So things like IPFS, admittedly it needs time to mature itself as a technology, could start to solve some of that stuff.
So I agree with the point that if we keep the data in the hospital system or in the silos that we already have, there's still going to be the points of failure of that hospital system getting hacked, right? So I don't think it solves that problem. But as there are growing pressures, both through policymakers as well as through researchers and others and patients to get access to that data, there is this growing concern about sharing the data and the points of vulnerability that are introduced by sharing that data or opening up APIs or taking in patient-generated data from remote monitoring devices. So I think that I don't think blockchain is going to solve the problem of a hospital getting hacked, but I think it can help address the problem of the security of that information that's being shared and of opening up points of access to the data that the hospital holds for those sharing purposes.
I think that particularly, that last point where you mentioned, the sharing of information, that definitely is becoming more secure, but by no means is it eliminating all sorts of problems. One of the recent very interesting development has been Microsoft partnering with Ethereum to launch the blockchain as a service. I think it was mentioned earlier in the morning as well. Essentially, it's on Azure Cloud. You just, they say it's one click, but it takes a lot more than one click to get to the whole thing. I was wondering if any of the panelists, if you've experienced how the blockchain as a service is working on the cloud, particularly what the difference is between running blockchain as a service in this cloud virtualized environment as opposed to running your own low-level development servers and more.
Well, I think it's a really interesting way to give easy access to people to start touching and playing with and experimenting with the technology. I think it introduces the same problem and mindset that currently exists when you start asking a company, do you want to implement a blockchain to solve all your problems? And they say, yeah, but I want to own the infrastructure, I want to own the process. And they kind of miss the point of the decentralization and distribution of a network. Similarly, whether you're talking about cloud infrastructure or kind of more traditional server infrastructure that might exist on-premise in an organization, it has to be a combination of both. If you start having blockchains that run exclusively in one Azure data center, you've just kind of recreated a new problem. But if you can make these things extremely diversified across a number of cloud providers, across a number of different types of server infrastructure, that's where it starts to become interesting. I think what is really cool about this blockchain as a service concept is just to give relatively average, moderate developers the ability to start experimenting with the new technology. Because one thing that's very much lacking in this space is people that have experience. So even if it's just a learning tool, it's a great step in the right direction.
I would agree. I think there's a huge amount of value in making it easier for people to play with technologies like blockchain. I think as a parallel is, as we've had more and more open data, from a genetic standpoint, et cetera, you start to create the ability for amateur scientists or amateur researchers to actually start doing meaningful work. And I think it's sort of critical to maturing the technology and getting to a place where it can be more widely adopted.
Yeah, it's really important for academia too. We're your pipeline for your next future employees too, right, Vikram? But it's been a little bit harder too when they nearly arrest and dismiss a Harvard researcher because he collected a few bitcoins while doing research on blockchain. And those are things that are a great disincentive to people who are tenure tracking faculty members to do that, and their students who might be also a little bit fearful too. So we've been kind of boldly charging ahead at UCF and gotten some good administrative covering to be able to explore some of these things, but it's not that way everywhere too, especially when there's unrestricted income that could be coming into a particular department or something. They're quite leery of that too, just for mining. I'm talking about for mining activities, but having some sandbox that people can learn and play in, I think is a really good thing. And it's a little different than that model, but some of the other things we're seeing, like I was reading from ONC, the Mayo Clinic article and study. Anybody here from that team? Really good work on FHIR and some of the ways you can do URLs and URIs instead of having to have everything stored locally too, so that you do that with the fast healthcare interoperability resource and being able to do that. So those are some of the things that I think might help us too along the way.
Yeah, especially this becoming standardized, this blockchain becoming standardized reminds me, back in the day there was a company called Sun, got bought up by Oracle, and they, the time hardware hadn't been commoditized properly, it sort of reminds me of the same outlook that eventually blockchain will become commoditized in the same fashion. I remember reading a story, it's a while back, students at MIT and Harvard, I think, together organized a hackathon. And they created a miner, back in the day when mining was still profitable, they created a new miner software that would allow them to make a little more money, and they sort of won the hackathon, and actually they got arrested for it, and the software and the computer was trashed. The police didn't really understand what was going on. There was a lot of sort of fear and misunderstandings about it. I mean, these guys just lost, their laptops, and so they were pretty furious about that. So that was around the time when Microsoft initially announced that they would partner with Ethereum and sort of standardize this. So we hope down the line it becomes much easier for people, especially in academia, to do that kind of research. Actually, somebody brought this up, so I want to go back to it. Biometric identities. I know in case of India particularly, they launched a project to have biometric identities of millions of people. I think they actually finally reached close to 1 billion. Wonder what the panel thinks of the blockchain becoming some sort of conduit for any type of biometric identities, and particular applications to emergency situations where it's hard to recognize who is who, or to get like emergency contact info.
Yeah, I read something, I don't remember where I was reading this in an article about, the application of blockchain in healthcare, and the simple question of, well, do you want all of your medical information to be visible on a public network where people can kind of decipher from that what's wrong with you? And the answer is generally no. Would you want potentially to have anonymized data that could participate in some sort of like medical research? Potentially yes. But then the last question was, well, would you want somebody to be notified if your heart rate dropped below 40 beats per minute? It's kind of an interesting new opportunity for me to say, I want to have control over my data, but under certain circumstances, I want certain things, certain attributes about me to unlock that data for a medical professional. And that could totally be biometrics. I mean, something like my heartbeat indicating that I'm having a heart condition or that I've fallen unconscious, and have that be an unlock, a private key access to my data. Yeah, I think there's totally an opportunity for that to be meaningful.
Yeah, in addition to the NIMI band I was talking about, which is more for a hospitalist or someone for a patient, we worked on a project a couple years ago along with J&J and GE and Cisco and Florida Blue to build an intelligent home. And inside of there, we had a mirror that could automatically take your pulse, could automatically gauge weight, and some of the things in the use cases would allow you to automatically have a call back to a nurse practitioner that might be able to come up if you started to have the signs of an episode. So sort of predictive analytics that might be able to head off a heart condition in a male over 45 before it happened. So the clinicians actually designed all of this, and we tried to put the hardware together to be able to do that in a use case. Those are some of the things that might be coming our way too. And then what do you do with that data and how you make it actionable? The blockchain may have a role in that too, to guide that transactional area.
Yeah, even now, when you install new software, Firefox or something, there's always that option, send anonymous usage data. it's not too far-fetched to click that option for your health data too. You can imagine somebody going to the hospital, like you were mentioning earlier, Matt, going to the hospital for a particular problem. It's not unfeasible to think that the same thing could apply. You just check a box that says, send anonymous usage data on me when I crash. A person crashing is a different story, but just imagine that, you falling unconscious is equivalent to crashing. You can imagine the same thing sort of translating over. Probably this sort of stuff will become more important as people become more used to that type of technology.
I think the other point about biometrics is, it's not just about, acute situations where, patients fallen or patients, in immediate need of care. We're working with a company now called Cardiologic, based in Israel. And essentially they monitor data about your heart, particularly your left ventricle. And they can essentially predict weeks in advance that you're exhibiting signs of congestive heart failure, and can notify you, through a nurse practitioner callback or something like that, to essentially change the dosing of the medication that could prevent an episode before you're even hospitalized. So I think the promise of capturing valuable, high quality, high fidelity biometric data is really, really high.
It's huge. Yeah, particularly, somebody mentioned earlier this morning about proxies. And I think that would be a huge, huge leap, particularly proxies in healthcare who can act on your behalf and inform on your behalf to other people. Jody was around, we would have asked for the legal implications. No, I'm just kidding, actually. But you were going to add something?
Oh, no, that's okay, yeah.
All right. I think let's check on the time. We still have plenty of time. Oh, we have a question. Yes, please.
Well, that is a Jody question.
No.
Yeah,
Rewards program.
I can't answer the reimbursement, but just so for those of you who maybe couldn't hear the question over there too, it's about electronic health records at the point of need in an ER setting or something like that. There's another part of the federal government, though, that you might look for some answers to, and that's within the military. The military spends a lot of money on health sciences, and in particular around emergency care. If the notion of a digital dog tag has always been that thing that gave you basic demographic information. Now it's actually storing electronic health information too. And I know that's going to be a central tenet, whether it's electronic in a blockchain or cloud or on some physical device for our military personnel and into the VA. There's a large contract just let this last year called DIMSUM, which is the Defense's new $11 billion contract to try and pull together one ring to rule them all, I guess, all of the different records all in one. And the VA is participating in that too. There may be some hope in there in the process that you would go through to have that, but that was what Jody and I were talking about a little bit too, about the stewardship of that and who has responsibility for it. We might get some lessons learned from there that actually have worked well for a number of years, electronic or otherwise, that might be able to come into the civilian side. So that might be another place to look at for where you could find some lessons learned. We've learned a lot too by looking at combat medic versus trauma nurse and how some of the needs are similar. That's probably the best answer I can give you.
I think, bringing it back to the importance of this technology evolving to solve that problem is that everything you just mentioned, as impactful as it can be at point of care, is also extremely risky, because the moment all that information is gathered and collected into one place, it becomes extremely vulnerable to attack.
Yeah.
And that's why a blockchain becomes a really interesting kind of new architecture for this type of information, so that you can, as much as possible, de-risk that. Because the last thing you would want is that type of information being collected across a population as big as the United States, and then making that sit inside a central database managed by quote unquote secure firewalls implemented by the government. Because every secure database we've seen has proven to not be exactly that. So this kind of introduces the importance of this topic in my mind. The ability to gather that information, the ability to use something like distributed storage, distributed transactional databases like a blockchain to gather it at the point in time when it's necessary. And then to Vikram's question earlier, how do you actually have the authority to unlock that information through the use of something like biometrics? There's a whole bunch of things that need to intersect, but I think where the data resides is a really, really important part of that.
I want to actually add one quick perspective to that. I understand your pain very easily. Being a medical student, I have a good idea from where you're coming from. It's one of the unfortunate realities that medical literacy, just in that sense, is quite low. People either just don't care or don't know because they're so mentally occupied with this. We tried something to the extent of doing a rewards program where people would be incentivized and rewarded in terms of lower cost of visits and so on. And that didn't work very successfully, but I imagine something like that on a larger scale may perhaps be much more successful. So get that and then you.
So what I've heard so far is that the electronic medical record can't store data on the blockchain. So we can't necessarily store electronic medical data in full on the blockchain due to scalability challenges. Instead, we're storing pointers. And there's distributed storage solutions potentially that can, permit the sharing of that data. Is this anything different than, just standard cloud storage that's emerging, or is it some other technology?
I read because the topic of cloud and blockchains kind of seem to fit really well together, and I think they do for all intents and purposes. I think the cloud is a really interesting way to scale this technology and to create inherently distributed infrastructures. But what's often missed in the topic around the cloud is that what we're really doing is we're probably even more centralizing the data that we all rely on. Because what used to exist within the bounds of organizations behind their own security, on multiple servers across multiple organizations, is now being outsourced to organizations like Google and Microsoft and Amazon to maintain on their behalf. So now what used to sit within the walls of thousands of companies has been centralized into the walls of maybe 5 or 6 companies. So we've introduced kind of a new centralization of that information. Different, we rely on these companies to be experts in their field to offer more secure infrastructure, but it hasn't really removed the risk. To the extent that Amazon or Google or any one of these cloud providers has vulnerability, which they do, maybe less vulnerability than you maintaining your own, IT infrastructure on your own as an organization. That's where there's an opportunity to say, well, can we go back to a distributed model that does leverage the cloud, but that potentially breaks up the information that we need into multiple places and creates a very simple mechanism to reaggregate it when necessary. As simply as, if you imagine for like the non-technical people in the audience, if you imagine having a piece of paper and cutting it up into 100 pieces and giving those 100 pieces to 100 different people and having a secret password that allows you to reaggregate those pieces of that puzzle. If any one of these people gets attacked or robbed or anything, that one piece of paper in that 100-piece puzzle is meaningless. But when I reaggregate them, I can read the information and have kind of meaningful insights out of it. I think that's where the concept of storing medical information has to go.
We had one question there and then that one.
Hello. You mentioned blockchain as a service through Microsoft earlier. I'm really wondering what service are they really providing, and are they trying to accomplish the same thing that maybe like Jim is doing as far as their general platform? And also, as far as EMR, if you already mentioned this, sorry, who are the contenders as far as, what does it look like as far as who's going to dominate this space? Is it Jim or is it other people? And maybe y'all can comment on that.
Okay, sorry, I didn't understand the last part of the question, but I'll get to answer.
Who's going to dominate the EMR space as far as blockchain EMRs?
Oh, okay, blockchain EMRs. I heard HHS. I'm like, what? Sorry. Particularly with blockchain as a service, what Microsoft is trying to do in a very nice fashion, I think they are enabling, one, like I was mentioned earlier, they're enabling you to scale, but they're also adding the level of accountability. So blockchain allows one very, very nice types of accountability where data really cannot be skipped or missed without some consequences showing up somewhere. So what they're trying to do is very different from much of anything that's been done so far, which is to allow the blockchain in a very isolated, virtualized environment to scale up very fast and still have the same level of accountability that you may not find in other cloud infrastructures. To answer the second part, I think the major stakes really still are with the insurance companies. I may be wrong on this, but I think eventually they're going to be the ones who support this new type of development of electronic records because they may be ultimately the ones who benefit the most from the frictionless development.
Yeah, and which company they buy is probably still up for grabs. anybody's game.
So, to return to this idea that there has to be a central authority for storing this data, to me, raises some questions about the appropriateness of talking about blockchain and healthcare just in general. But let's say just for a minute that we have a central authority and we're using blockchain to track these transactions. Even the ID, though, that you stick into that blockchain could be considered a member ID and therefore PHI. And so my question to you is this really an appropriate application of this technology to this particular industry? Or is it really better suited for the financial industry where it grew up? Are we looking to apply this because we really want it to work?
Yeah,
I think
you guys answer first. Yeah.
I think Micah from GEM kind of said it well. This is a data management technology. I think absolutely there are reasons to be skeptical when we're talking about something as sensitive as medical information. And I think we need to take baby steps along that process to get, we're not going to go immediately to a full-blown EMR system distributed across a blockchain. And I think there are solutions and applications that can evolve. I'm demoing a very, very simple one later this afternoon that I think captures, because of its simplicity, the opportunity to use something like a distributed system where there may not even need to be an association between the identity of a patient and the use of the blockchain. To give you a sneak peek into it, we're talking about prescription fraud and how do you identify a unique identifier to the issuance of a prescription to make sure that the prescription is not being redeemed fraudulently. That does not need to be associated to the name of the person and their health insurance provider or anything like that. It's essentially a financial transaction where the asset in question is the issuance of a prescription, and I want to make sure that they're not photocopying a prescription paper and going into multiple places to get that same drug from multiple pharmacies. That could be an application that's impactful in a niche use case within healthcare that doesn't require me to go and trace my entire medical history on an open public technology. But I think that's the end potential, the end goal. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a lot of really interesting research being done around transaction level privacy and encryption within blockchain transactions to make sure that you're maintaining as much control and privacy on the individual pieces of data that are moving across these networks. But I would not be one to say that today we should encourage any type of national jurisdiction to move to a blockchain EMR system. But I think these types of conversations lead us towards asking the right questions.
I would agree. I mean, I don't think in any sort of execution of a blockchain system, it's a panacea for all of the challenges facing interoperability between medical records. I think it's one valuable tool in an arsenal of many to solve a very large problem. I view it as most valuable in the context of permissioning. So, you're tracking how records are moving around within a system, which is a challenge today. And so blockchain is very useful, for that application. But I think, it would be, prudent to, realize that there are a lot of technologies that we're going to have to leverage in order to solve, sort of the $1 trillion in costs that come from, poor management of health records in this country.
Yeah, not just any one technology, I think, is part of that too. And there will be many use cases, and some of those use cases, particularly ones that are involving financial data for healthcare and coding and other things like that, are probably good candidates for that to be in the blockchain for a transactional history that is immutable and can't be changed. So I think that's where you might look. And then some of the things that we're seeing with the peer-to-peer networking, where you want to be able to connect people to, those are other areas that we think have some, where you don't want to give people medical information, you just want to give them information about the fact that some event has occurred. Those are things that might be appropriate in a patient-centered design and something that is more patient-centered than provider-centered in lieu of or as an alternative to what the insurance company may keep as data on you.
I think what was interesting about Bitcoin as a payment mechanism is that for the first time, regardless of if you were talking about domestic payments, international payments, any type of payments, there became a standard mechanism to do that. So if I send a Bitcoin in Canada versus in the US versus in the Philippines or China, the mechanism of sending that Bitcoin was exactly the same. When you look at the traditional finance industry, depending on the jurisdiction and the country you're in, financial transactions happen extremely differently, sitting on different types of infrastructure, sitting on different types of systems. I'm Canadian, and I know that sending money in Canada is quite different than sending money in the United States. So if we can get to that same kind of simplicity and standardization of how do you send information that is pertinent to my medical history or my health, that does not have to be jurisdiction specific, because we talk in this context a lot about U.S. law and U.S. regulation. But one of the really, really exciting potentials of this is to create kind of an international standard, because more and more we're in this increasingly mobile world where people are not necessarily staying put in one country. They might spend time in their lives in 3 or 4 different countries and going through 3 or 4 different medical infrastructures or systems. And if we can get to a place where that becomes interoperable, not only within or between healthcare organizations, but also across boundaries.
So you bring up a few more use cases: global health,
Yeah.
epidemiology, maybe medical tourism, and those might be all ways that there is frictionless records shared across international boundaries.
If I get a procedure done in India, how do I make sure that my care professionals in Canada have access to that information in a way that is simple and seamless and private and secure?
One of the things that we're looking for, we just got a book contract, is some of the other use cases that you guys are finding, whether in the financial space, the health space, or others too. So love to hear from some of you who may have interesting ideas about how you're going to use this technology.
Yeah, we're actually running close to being out of time, so I think somebody else raised their hand in the back. Just come up to me up here. We'll be happy to answer. But if audience members, anybody, if you're interested in contributing use cases, even ideas to our book, please reach out to us. You can find me here somewhere, or obviously email. That would be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.